What are today's sentiments about German people? Are German people maybe richer as some of the local population? Is there any kind of gap still?
I think there's definitely gaps economically, like I was talking about, like with the housing, you would see very clear differences and opportunities that are available.
Servus and hallo. How is it in Afrikaans?
Gandet.
Gandet? Okay. Well, that's not easy. That's Hannah, by the way, and she was actually my German student here at Agnes Scott College, but now we're talking in English, and she has a very interesting background. And so today we're talking about what role languages actually play in Namibia today, and also a little bit about the history. Hannah, you were taking German classes here, but you already had German back in Namibia, right? Also, the history is kind of
pretty tied to Germany. Yes.
Pretty tied to Germany, which honestly, I'm as an Austrian, I had no idea of. Seriously. Okay.
Which is very interesting because Namibians learn a lot about German history and European history, so it's interesting seeing what people know.
Yeah. So Hannah, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, I guess I'll start off with the history. Namibia was found by German explorers, I guess, in the early 1800s. I think about 1884, they landed on the coast in a town called Luderitz. They discovered the country and started moving inland to see what it was like. And at around about that time, Germany claimed Namibia as a colony and started, I guess, trying to find ways to settle and have people there. However, there was obviously resistance by the people, the local population, and in about 1904 to 1906, there was a massive genocide in Namibia that was unfortunately done by the German government. I think at that point it was Chancellor Bismarck, and he enacted policy to exterminate the people who were giving him a lot of resistance. So there was at one point a very big, it's less now, probably because of the genocide, but at one point it was one of the biggest populations, and that's the Herero people in Namibia and the Nama people, and they were fighting very hard to, you know, maintain and retain their land. But unfortunately they were killed. The genocide happened and the war was waged in about central Namibia, close to a town further up from Windhoek, which is the capital, in Okahanja, and people were pushed back into the Kalahari Desert in the east, into Botswana even. So people were killed all along the way and pushed so far into the desert that a lot of people died from a lack of water and a lack of food. And that led to 80%, between 75 and 80% of the Herero tribe being killed, and between 30 and 40% of the Nama tribe being killed. The people who weren't killed were taken to a concentration camp off the west coast of Namibia called Shark Island, and they were made to work there, and they were kept there under very terrible conditions. This is known as, I think, one of the first genocides of the 20th century. It's something that people don't usually learn about, but it was massive and very atrocious for the population. However, when Germany stepped into the First World War in 1914 to 1918, by the end of the war, Germany lost all of its colonies in Africa. So that includes Namibia, Tanzania, I believe, and I think Cameroon, which were German colonies in Africa. So Namibia was then given over to Britain, and Britain didn't really want to take responsibility for Namibia because they didn't feel it was worth a lot as a colony. So they handed it over to South Africa. And South Africa was under British rule. And in particular, the Boer population, so the white population in South Africa, was in power in government. So they enacted very similar policies to what was in South Africa. So in the 1960s, I believe, when the apartheid legislation was started and they started having, you know, separate quotas for people groups and distribution of farmland and where black people could be and where white people could be. And Indians and coloreds. They were like 4 categories in South Africa. It was something pretty similar happening in Namibia. Not exactly the same and not probably as extreme, but there was definitely very clear racial divide to what you'd see in South Africa between the 1960s and up until 1990 when Namibia became independent. South Africa in 1994, but when Mandela was released in 1990, I believe. So it was kind of like between 1990 and 1994, there was like a transitionary period of like South Africa starting to adapt new legislation and all that. And so it's very close in terms of the history to what was happening in South Africa. So I think I've covered it all.
Oh, wow. Actually, I'm kind of shocked. Like, I've never heard about the genocide before. Never, ever. And like, I don't know if the Germans learn about that, because like, I know in school I'm Austrian, so we tend to focus a little bit more on the Austrian history, but still, like, it's kind of shocking that I never heard about that at all.
Yeah. So I think sometimes they've linked even like what happened with the concentration camps during the Holocaust and during the Second World War in Germany, with like Auschwitz and other big ones in Germany. Was pretty much they got their policy from what they'd implemented in Namibia first.
Wow.
So
I had no idea, because like the Second World War, like we discussed it a lot. It's kind of a huge topic in history, even in schools, but like never about Namibia. That's shocking. So, and what about today? Like, are there Germans still living in Namibia?
Yes, there are. There's a pretty significant, I wouldn't say big, but there's a pretty significant German population still in Namibia, and they still feel like it's home. Like a lot of Germans are raised in Namibia, born in Namibia, and they've got a whole history of like their grandparents having been in Namibia. So they're definitely there. We've got a lot of the celebrations the big ones that you'd have in Germany, I suppose. I don't know if you also have it in Austria, but like Oktoberfest,
Right,
pretty big. So that happens. Yeah, I would say for the most part the German population's in the capital, in Windhoek. Some of them might be on the coast. Swakopmund is a big city. And then probably in smaller towns where they can have farmland. Some Germans still own farms in Namibia, like cattle farms, livestock farms, since Namibia is so big. So there's a lot of area for farming.
Okay, and so like, do the Germans, like, I don't know, maybe in the capital city, do they mostly live in their own kind of like areas, or are they kind of like dispersed in a way and almost mixed with the locals?
Yes and no. I mean, there's a very clear disparity that you'll see with, in general, the white population. So when I'm saying white population, I'm saying the Germans and the Boers. So there's a white population that the ancestors of the Dutch that landed in South Africa in the 1500s, and they got farms all over South Africa. They stayed there, and then some of them moved up to Namibia. Probably around about that time, maybe a little bit later. Some of them have even moved up now, but yes, so like the white population in general, there's a very clear disparity. So they will live, for the most part, in different areas where you'd see like bigger houses or more space, more land. They'd be in those areas. Not saying that there's not black people there. There are. Obviously, after independence, there were more opportunities for the local population to buy housing in areas that they might not have been for, and a higher standard of living than what they might be used to. So yes, they do. There's a very obvious kind of disparity, but also there are black people that live in similar neighborhoods. It's not like you can't. It's just sometimes it might be a little bit harder. But there's still German schools in Namibia.
So German schools, is there like the main language is German? Like they
take it in different ways. Okay. So there's one, there's DHPS, Deutsche Hochschule.
Okay.
I was at DSSW or Delta. So my school is about 70 years old, I think. Yeah. And yes, it was started off as a just German school. They taught all their lessons in German, but now it's semi-private, so that means they get some funding from government. So I think the rules are a bit different when you're getting funding from government. So they still have German classes, and there's still native speakers, native German speakers that go to that school, but there's also, I would say, a bigger, I don't want to say local because the German population there pretty much is local, but there's a bigger black and colored population going to the German schools, because your other classes would be taught in English. I only had my German class in German, and everything else was in English. And that was the same for the native German speakers, the mother tongue German speakers. So they would also just have their German class in German, obviously at a higher level, but then they'd have all of their classes in English. And that's the case for quite a few schools. I think it's only DHPS, which is a private school, where they've got all of their classes in German, or most of them. I think there's like 2 options. You can take it all in German, or you can take some in English and still have German. But it's still a requirement in those high schools to take German. In my primary school, however, it was Catholic school, the Holy Cross Convent, and we had a lot of German nuns, and the school was like 125 years old. So at one point it was only a white school with a significant German population going to that school, because it was private and very well run. It was an all-women's school at one point, but when I was there it was mixed. But from grade 5 we were introduced to German. Very basic German. Yeah, there's kind of German in different parts of the school curriculum, but for the most part it's when students are in private institutions. There's a big push.
So like in a normal school that is not private, like
public schools?
Yeah, public schools, like what is the main language there?
English. So we, like when people are like, what's the main language in Namibia? What do you all speak? I can't say one, because we've got about 26 tribes, maybe 13, and then like there's smaller groups into that. So maybe I'm saying the wrong thing, but we've got quite a few tribes. More languages that go with those tribes. So like I was mentioning, the Herero and the Nama people, the biggest tribe in Namibia now is the Oshivambu people. They make about half of the population, about 1 million people, in a country of 2.5 million people. Very small, yes. We're the second.
But the land is huge, right?
It's massive. It's about the size of South Africa. So if you're putting that into perspective, it's very big. We're the second most sparsely populated place on earth after Mongolia. You've got a lot of land per square mile for the people in the country.
So is the official language also now English?
Yes, so the official language is English, just because we've got so many languages. That's kind of the unifying language. It's what you'll speak when you go into town. When you meet people, quite a few people will know English, especially in the capital. If you go to pretty remote places, which they are, because Namibia is so big, then it might be harder for people to communicate with you. But if you're in the capital, going to major tourist sites, you'll get around with English fine. And some places, at least tourist destinations, you might even get someone who can speak German. So,
what about Afrikaans?
Afrikaans. Yes, so Afrikaans is kind of the way Dutch has evolved in Namibia. As I mentioned earlier, the Boer population came into Namibia. I guess they weren't the Boers then, but when they were from the Netherlands, but when they landed, they then became Boers, which translates to farmer in English, and they spoke Dutch. And as language evolves, it became something that combined, I guess, elements of local Namibian languages and Dutch to form Afrikaans. Although it's related to being a Boer language, the language of the Boers. There's also tribes within Namibia, such as my dad's tribe, that's their first language. So the mixed population in some cases, I'm mixed, if you didn't realize, but so my dad's great-grandparents, I guess for my dad, great-grandparents, would have been white, and they were, in some cases, German, in some cases, Dutch. But anyways, they picked up on the language of the Boers. They learned it, they spoke it, and it's now their first language. Yeah, even though it was formerly a language of oppression, and in South Africa, and the school system's kind of forced upon local students to learn and be taught in, and something that just to get a job you'd need to kind of know Afrikaans to get a job with like the white farmers, the white bush. So by now it's very accepted. I mean, it's seen as a local language. A lot of students would learn it in school. I think even more than German. You'd probably find that more prevalent in public schools.
So Hannah, what do you consider as your native language actually?
English.
English,
But that's because my mom's from Zimbabwe and my dad's from Namibia. So I was raised in Namibia all of my life. I was born in Zimbabwe, but we moved when I was very young. My dad couldn't get citizenship in Zimbabwe, which was good with the way things turned out in Zimbabwe. But what that means is that my parents had to come together on one language. They had to decide on one language. So when my parents met, my mom knew English because, well, Zimbabwe was a British colony. People learned English. She knew her local language as well, but that was like, she knew English. My dad knew a little bit of English because he spoke Afrikaans at home. So he had to learn English to be able to communicate with my mother. So they decided to settle on English and they raised my sisters and I in English. But since I'm in Namibia, I had Namibian friends. I had my dad's family. I learned Afrikaans as well. So I would say it's a very close second. Although I'm losing some of it since I've been away from home for so long, which I'm like,
So, and in Namibia, do you also have tribes that still speak their own language? That
oh,
was
yes.
Not so much influenced
by yes, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. So even though I'm saying English is the official language and it's the language used quite frequently, a lot of people still do not know English fluently, and they can get by with English a little bit. Some cases not at all, but all of the local languages are very much alive.
And so, like, do they also teach that sometimes in certain schools, like any kind of languages that certain tribes have? Do you know that?
Yeah, that's very interesting actually that you're asking that, because I recently did a paper on what is better to be taught in African countries, the indigenous language or the language of the language that was brought through colonization, the European languages. And although English is seen as a unifying language, there have been steps taken across Africa, but in Namibia as well, that in public schools, if you're in a certain region or in a certain neighborhood where a traditional language is prevalent, you would learn in that language for the first 3 years of primary school. I was working at a school over the summer, a primary school, and the children knew very little English because they were being taught in their local language. So they were being taught in Oshiherero, which is they're part of the Herero tribe. So they were being taught in that, and they would be taught in that up until 4th grade. And then 4th grade they'd switch to English, and they'd have an English education kind of. Some courses that are now being taught in university level, but very few, and English is still dominant in the education system. Yeah, I think in regions away from the capital, I can't speak much for them because I'm not there, but there are examinations, I believe, that are taken in traditional languages, so you could get your science exam in a local language.
Yeah. And like, do you understand like the different languages from different tribes in Namibia, or is it like a completely different language to you?
It's a completely different language to me, and there's no way even that the tribes will be able to understand what another person is saying unless obviously they grew up learning it. I mean, if you've been in the country long enough, you'll be able to identify when a person is speaking a certain language. You can be like, oh, they're speaking Oshivambo, oh, they're speaking Herero, oh, they're speaking Nama. But no, unless you grew up and you learned it, like you'd learn your own language, there's no way. And that's the case with most of Africa. Like, as you might know, if you don't know, fun fact, there are over 2,000 languages in sub-Saharan Africa, and there are 6,000 in the world. So we have about the densest language diversity. And that's when people are like, oh, Africa's so diverse. Yes, it is, and especially when it comes to languages. So Namibia is seen as kind of an anomaly because it's got fewer languages, I would say under 30. In places like Tanzania, there are over 100 languages. In places like Nigeria, there are over 500 languages. So making an education system around local languages becomes a bit complicated because it's then like a power thing. Like government at the time can be saying, okay, we're all gonna learn Herero, and people are going to be like, oh, what about our language? So it becomes a bit challenging, and I think that's why countries choose to stick with English.
Okay, interesting. And like, do you also know if like Namibia or like the local people ever received any kind of reimbursement from Germany or the United Kingdom?
Not the UK. I doubt it from the UK. From Germany, however, there's talk about that in the news actually currently, of people wanting Germany to, I guess, send out an apology for the genocide that took place and for there to be reparations. I do believe that the German government, I know that it has very strong ties with Namibia, and it works with Namibia economically on quite a few things. In terms of like a formal reparations, I haven't heard of anything. There might be now. I do know, however, that there's been bones and skeletons returned of former ancestors of the tribes that were killed during the genocide. So they had the bones and sometimes the artifacts of Herero and Nama people that has been returned, and there's been efforts to like create museums or like places to commemorate this. Just because it's not very spoken about, and a lot of people wouldn't know about it unless you learned about it in school. So I think there's efforts. Germany has been pretty receptive in trying to work with Namibia and provide opportunities in some cases for students to study in Germany. So yeah.
What are today's sentiments about German people? Are German people maybe richer as some of the local population? Is there any kind of gap still?
I think there's definitely gaps economically, like I've spoken about, like with the housing, you would see very clear differences and opportunities that are available. I know quite a few of the German students who I went to school with. They had dual citizenship with Namibia and then Germany, and they could go study for university in Germany after finishing. Not a lot of people stay to study.
So like the German people don't stay there to study in Namibia, is that?
Yeah, so they would probably go to university in Germany, do a couple of years there, probably maybe work in Germany if they can, and then probably come back like for holidays to visit family and possibly to retire in Namibia. The disparity is pretty clear to me. I wonder if it is to other people, but it's pretty obvious to me. In terms of like feelings towards German people, I would say that it's not very obvious what the feelings are. I think now that when it's coming up in the news about the history, it is causing a lot of old pain and hurt to come up. But I would say that that hasn't affected the German population in Namibia. They're still part of the country, and in many ways they're seen as Africans. They have connections with people. You go to school with them, you work with them, you live with them. So yeah, I really hope it stays that way. But yeah, when history is being spoken about, it's hard.
Okay, well, thank you, Hannah. That was really informative.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and then we'll see each other in a second video where we talk about United States versus Namibia. Okay. Okay. See you. Thanks.